The blood on Mason Harding's knuckles was still fresh when he first saw Zara Montgomery standing in the middle of Main Street, completely transfixed by a single wildflower growing through a crack in the dusty boardwalk. It was September 1878 in Nebraska City, Nebraska, and Mason had just finished a fight outside the saloon that left another man nursing a broken jaw and him nursing a profound sense of emptiness that whiskey could no longer fill. He was 26 years old and felt ancient, hardened by years of cattle drives, gunfights, and a world that seemed determined to grind the softness out of every living thing. Yet, here was this woman, maybe 23 or 24, kneeling in her pale blue dress without a care for the dust coating the hem, examining that scraggly little flower like it was the most precious thing she had ever encountered. Mason stopped in his tracks, his boots creating small clouds in the dry earth. Other people walked around her, some shaking their heads, others muttering about damn fool women blocking the street. But she did not move, did not seem to even notice them. She was touching the petals with such gentleness that Mason felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, something he had thought died years ago when he buried his parents after the fever took them both within a week of each other. "You planning to stay there all day?" he heard himself say, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. She looked up at him then, and Mason felt the full force of those eyes, green as new grass after spring rain. Her face was heart-shaped, framed by dark brown hair that had escaped its pins in several places, and there was dirt smudged on her cheek. She smiled at him, completely unperturbed by his gruff tone. "Do you see this?" she asked, gesturing to the flower. "It is growing through solid wood. That boardwalk was laid down, 5 years ago? And this little thing decided it would not give up. It pushed through darkness and hardness to reach the sun. How can I not stop and appreciate that kind of determination?" Mason stared at her like she had started speaking a foreign language. "It is a weed." "It is a prairie clover," she corrected gently, standing up and brushing at her skirts in a half-hearted way that suggested she did not really care about the dust. "And it is beautiful. Everything is beautiful if you just take the time to really see it." He wanted to argue with her, to tell her that the world was hard and ugly, and there was no point in romanticizing weeds, but something in her expression stopped him. She looked at him with such openness, such complete lack of judgment, despite the blood still drying on his hands, that he found himself tongue-tied for the first time in years. "I am Zara Montgomery," she said, extending her hand to him without hesitation. "I arrived yesterday from Boston. My aunt lives here, though she is currently traveling, so I am staying at the boarding house for now." Mason looked at her outstretched hand and then at his own bloodied knuckles. "I should clean up first." "Probably," she agreed, but she kept her hand extended. He shook it, feeling the softness of her palm against his calloused skin, and something passed between them in that moment, something electric and unexpected. She did not flinch from the blood or the roughness of his grip. She just smiled at him again, that same open, genuine smile that made his chest ache. "Mason Harding," he finally managed. "It is nice to meet you, Mason Harding," she said, "even if you think my flower is just a weed." He surprised himself by almost smiling. "Almost? Never said it was not a nice weed." She laughed, a sound like bells, and Mason realized he was in trouble. Deep, complicated trouble of the kind that could change a man's entire life if he let it. Over the next few days, Mason found himself running into Zara Montgomery with increasing frequency, though he could not quite figure out if it was accident or design on his part. Nebraska City was not a large town, sitting right on the Missouri River, with a population of maybe 3,000 souls, so perhaps it was inevitable. But Mason had lived here for 5 years, and managed to avoid most people quite successfully. Yet now he seemed to turn every corner and find Zara examining something that everyone else walked right past. He found her by the river one morning, sitting on a fallen log and sketching in a leather-bound book. The early light made the water look like liquid gold, and she was trying to capture it with quick, confident strokes of charcoal. "You are an artist," he observed, approaching her with what he hoped was appropriate casualness. She glanced up, and her face brightened in a way that made his pulse quicken. "I try to be. I am not sure I am any good at capturing what I see, but I have to try. There is so much beauty everywhere that I feel like I will burst if I do not record some of it." Mason sat down on the log beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "What do you see that is so beautiful about this?" He gestured at the river, which to him looked like any other river, brown and sluggish in the late summer heat. "Look at the way the light hits the water," she said, pointing with her charcoal. "See how it is not just gold, but also pink and orange and even a little bit of purple. And look at those cottonwood trees on the far bank. Their leaves are just starting to turn, so you get this combination of green and yellow that will only last for a few weeks before they are completely golden. And the way the mist is rising from the water, it is like the river is breathing. The whole world is breathing right now, Mason. Can you not feel it?" He looked where she was pointing, really looked, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he saw what she was describing. The light was doing something strange and lovely to the water. The trees were caught in that in-between moment of transformation. The mist did look like breath, like the earth itself was alive and inhaling the new day. "I see it," he said quietly. And he did. It made him feel strange, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. "Good," Zara said, and she reached over and squeezed his hand briefly before returning to her sketch. "Most people have forgotten how to see. They look, but they do not really see. You have good eyes, Mason Harding. You just need to remember how to use them." He wanted to tell her that he had spent years teaching himself not to see too much, because seeing meant feeling, and feeling meant pain. But the words stuck in his throat, and instead, he just sat beside her as the sun climbed higher and she filled page after page with images of the river, the trees, the way the light fell across the water like a benediction. Mason's life had fallen into a predictable pattern over the past few years. He worked on the Henriksen Ranch about 5 miles outside of town, managing their cattle and horses. He was good with animals, better than he was with people, and Carl Henriksen paid him fairly and did not ask too many questions about his past. Mason lived in a small room above the general store, spent his evenings drinking at the Silver Spur Saloon, and occasionally got into fights with men who looked at him wrong or said something that rubbed him the wrong way. It was not a particularly good life, but it was his, and it was simple, and simple felt safe after everything he had been through. Then Zara Montgomery arrived and turned everything sideways. She had a way of appearing when he least expected it, always finding something to marvel at in the most unlikely places. He found her in the alley behind the butcher's shop one afternoon, watching a stray cat nursing her kittens in a wooden crate. "Look how gentle she is with them," Zara whispered, crouching down to observe the little family. "She is probably half-starved herself, but she is making sure they are fed and warm. Mothers are the same everywhere, are they not? Animal or human, that instinct to protect and nurture is just beautiful." Mason, who had come into the alley to take a shortcut to the hardware store, found himself kneeling beside her, watching the cats. The mother was a scraggly thing, one ear torn from some past fight, but she was cleaning her kittens with meticulous care. "My mother was like that," he found himself saying, the words escaping before he could stop them. "She would go without food to make sure my sister and I ate. Even when we did not have much, she made it feel like we had everything." Zara turned to look at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "She sounds wonderful. Is she still in Nebraska?" "No, she died 7 years ago. Fever. My father died 3 days after her, and my sister—" He stopped, the old pain rising up like bile in his throat. "My sister died the year before that. Childbirth. She was only 17. "Oh, Mason," Zara said, and she reached out and took his hand, just held it there in the dusty alley while the cat nursed her kittens and the world went on around them. "I am so sorry. That is too much loss for one person to carry." He wanted to pull his hand away, to rebuild the walls that he had so carefully constructed, but her touch was warm and solid and somehow made the pain feel less like it would drown him. So he let her hold his hand, and they knelt there together in silence, and something in Mason began to shift, like a door he had nailed shut was starting to crack open. The problem with Zara Montgomery, Mason quickly discovered, was that she made him want things he had convinced himself he could never have. She made him want a different life, a softer life, a life where he could afford to see beauty in small things instead of constantly watching for threats and disappointments. She made him want to be a better man than the one who settled disputes with his fists and drowned his loneliness in cheap whiskey. He started changing without quite meaning to. He washed more carefully in the mornings, paying attention to his appearance in a way he had not bothered with in years. He found himself taking longer routes through town in hopes of running into her, He started noticing things, the way the evening light turned the storefronts golden, how the blacksmith's dog always waited patiently outside for his master, the sound of children laughing as they played in the schoolyard. One evening, about 2 weeks after Zara's arrival, Mason found her sitting on the steps of the boarding house where she was staying, looking dejected in a way he had not seen before. It alarmed him more than he wanted to admit. "What is wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside her without invitation. She sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. "My aunt sent a telegram. She is not returning for another month at least. She is in Denver helping her daughter, my cousin, who just had twins and is apparently overwhelmed, which is completely understandable, but it means I am here alone for much longer than I anticipated, and my funds are running lower than I would like." "Can your family send you money?" Mason asked. Zara shook her head. "My parents died when I was 16. I have been living with various relatives since then, and they have been kind, but they have made it clear that I need to be self-sufficient. I came here hoping my aunt might help me find a position as a teacher or perhaps give art lessons to children. But now she is gone, and I know no one here, and the boarding house costs more than I expected." Mason's mind raced. "You could find work. Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry, is always looking for help, or the hotel might need someone." "I have been asking," Zara said quietly, "but I am a stranger here, and people are hesitant. I will keep trying, but I would be lying if I said I was not worried." He made a decision then, one that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. "I will talk to Carl Henriksen. His wife, Margaret, she has been complaining about needing help with their children in the house. They have 4 boys, all under the age of 10, and she is worn thin trying to manage everything. If you could help her, even just a few days a week, it would give you some income. And Margaret is a good woman. She would treat you fairly." Zara turned to him, her eyes wide. "You would do that for me?" "I would," he said simply, because it was true, and because saying it made him feel less empty than he had felt in years. She threw her arms around him then, pulling him into a hug that caught him completely off guard. She smelled like lavender and charcoal and something sweet he could not identify. And Mason found his arms coming up automatically to hold her, his hands settling carefully on her back. It had been so long since he had held anyone, since he had allowed himself this kind of closeness, that for a moment he felt like he might shake apart. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you, Mason." When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. Mason found himself smiling back, really smiling, the expression feeling strange and wonderful on his face. The next day, Mason rode out to the Henriksen ranch and spoke to Margaret while Carl was out checking the fence lines. Margaret was a stout woman with graying blonde hair and tired eyes that lit up when Mason explained about Zara. "A woman from Boston who can read and write and draw," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mason, if you are not making this up, you might just have saved my sanity. The boys need someone who can help with their lessons, and I need someone who can help me keep this house from falling down around our ears. Bring her by tomorrow, and we will see if we suit." They suited. Of course they did, because Zara had a way of finding beauty in chaos and turning it into something manageable. She started working for the Henriksens 3 days a week, helping Margaret with the cooking and cleaning, teaching the boys their letters and numbers, and somehow making the whole household run more smoothly. On her days off, she started giving art lessons to a few of the town children, whose parents could afford a few cents a week for the privilege. Mason watched her flourish, and something in him flourished too. He found himself inventing excuses to be at the ranch when she was there, fixing things that did not really need fixing, checking on horses that were perfectly fine. Carl noticed and said nothing, but Margaret noticed and smiled knowingly every time Mason appeared. One afternoon in early October, Mason was mending a section of fence near the house when Zara came out with a basket of apples and a jar of water. "Margaret thought you might be thirsty," she said, setting the basket down beside him. "Margaret thought that, did she?" Mason asked, his tone dry. Zara laughed. "All right, I thought it. But Margaret approved of me bringing it to you, which amounts to the same thing." Mason took the jar and drank deeply, the water cool and clean. Zara sat down on the grass beside his work area, spreading her skirts around her. The cottonwood trees were fully golden now, and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was not far behind. "I have been thinking," Zara said, picking up an apple and examining it like it was a precious jewel, "about how much my life has changed in just a few weeks. When I arrived here, I felt so lost. I wasn't sure where I belonged or what I was supposed to do with my life. But now I feel like I am exactly where I am meant to be. Is that strange? No, Mason said, setting down his tools and sitting beside her on the grass. I have been thinking the same thing. She turned to him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Have you? Before you came here, I was just going through the motions, he admitted. Working, drinking, fighting. It did not mean anything. I did not mean anything. But you have this way of making everything matter. You make me see things differently. How do I do that? She asked softly. You find beauty everywhere, he said, the words coming easier now. In weeds growing through boardwalks and stray cats and the way light hits water. You taught me to see the world through your eyes, and it is a better world than the one I was living in before. Zara reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. You had that ability in you all along, Mason. You just needed someone to remind you it was there. He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. I want to kiss you, he said, because he had learned from her that honesty, even when it was frightening, was better than hiding behind walls. Then kiss me, she said, and she was smiling that smile that made everything feel possible. Mason kissed her there on the grass beside the fence, with the golden leaves falling around them like blessings and the October sun warm on their faces. It was gentle at first, tentative, because he did not want to scare her or break this fragile, precious thing growing between them. But Zara kissed him back with a passion that surprised him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair. And Mason felt something in his chest crack wide open, letting light flood into all the dark places he had been hiding. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zara was flushed and her eyes were bright. I have been wanting you to do that for weeks, she confessed. Why did you not say something? Mason asked, his voice rough. Because I wanted you to come to it on your own, she said. I wanted you to want it, not feel obligated because I was interested. And I think we both needed time to find our footing with each other. I more than want it, Mason said, pulling her close again. I want you, Zara Montgomery. I want everything with you. It scares the hell out of me, but I want it. Then let us not be scared together, she said, and she kissed him again. And Mason knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed in a way he could never have anticipated and would never want to undo. Their courtship was the talk of Nebraska City within days, because small towns had very few secrets, and people loved to gossip about the rough cowboy who had been gentled by the woman from Boston. Mason found he did not care what people said. He was too busy learning how to live again, really live, not just survive. Zara showed him the world through her eyes in 100 small ways. She took him to the river at dawn to watch the mist rise and the birds begin their morning songs. She made him lie in the grass and look at clouds, finding shapes and stories in their formations. She dragged him to church socials and town dances, teaching him how to move with the music instead of just standing in the corner watching everyone else have fun. In return, Mason showed her the world he knew. He took her riding on his favorite horse, a bay mare named Cinnamon, who was gentle enough for someone who had never spent much time around horses. He taught her how to skip stones across the river, how to tell the difference between animal tracks, how to read the weather and the behavior of cattle and birds. He showed her the secret places he had discovered over years of wandering, a meadow full of wildflowers in summer, a grove of trees that turned such brilliant red in autumn they looked like they were on fire, a hill that offered a view of the whole valley spread out below, like a painting. They talked endlessly, about everything and nothing. Zara told him about growing up in Boston, about her parents who had loved each other deeply and died together in a carriage accident, about the feeling of being passed from relative to relative, always welcome but never quite home. Mason told her about his childhood on a small farm, about his sister Emily, who had married too young to a man who drank too much, about holding her hand as she bled to death bringing a stillborn baby into the world, about watching his parents give up after losing her, as if the fever was just an excuse for them to stop fighting. You have carried so much grief, Zara said one evening as they sat by the river, her head resting on his shoulder. How did you bear it? I did not bear it well, Mason admitted. I let it turn me hard. I stopped letting myself feel much of anything, because feeling hurt too much. But then you came along and cracked me open again, and I realized that feeling pain is the price we pay for feeling joy. You cannot have one without the other. "That is very wise," Zara said, lifting her head to look at him. "I learned it from you," Mason said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Everything good I am learning from you." By November, Mason knew he wanted to marry Zara. The knowledge sat in his chest like a certainty, solid and unshakable. But he worried that she might think it was too soon, that she might want to wait, that she might not feel the same intensity of emotion that he felt every time he looked at her. He confided in Carl one afternoon while they were moving cattle to the winter pasture. "Tell her how you feel," Carl said, his tone matter of fact. "Women appreciate honesty, and from what Margaret tells me, Miss Montgomery is head over heels for you. The only question is when you are going to make it official." "What if she says no?" Mason asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Then she says no, and you deal with it," Carl replied. "But from what I have seen, the only thing she will say no to is you wasting time not asking her." Mason took the advice to heart. On a cold November afternoon, when the first snow was threatening, he borrowed Margaret's buggy and took Zara to the hill with the best view in the county. He had packed a blanket and a basket of food, and they sat together watching the clouds roll in, heavy and gray and full of promise. "It is going to snow," Zara said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Look how the light changes when snow is coming. Everything gets this silvery quality, like the whole world is holding its breath in anticipation." "You make everything sound like poetry," Mason said, and he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I want to hear you make poetry out of the rest of my life." Zara turned to him, her eyes going wide when she saw the box. "Mason?" He opened it, revealing a simple gold ring with a small garnet set in the center. It had been his grandmother's ring, the only valuable thing his mother had left him, and he had kept it hidden away for years, never imagining he would have someone to give it to. "I know it is fast," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we have only known each other for 2 months, but I also know that I love you, Zara Montgomery. I love the way you see the world, and I love the way you have taught me to see it too. I love your kindness and your joy and the way you find beauty in everything, even in broken-down cowboys who did not think they deserved a second chance. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Zara's face, but she was smiling that brilliant smile that had first captured his heart. "Yes," she said, and then louder. "Yes, Mason Harding, I will marry you. I will marry you and spend the rest of my life showing you how beautiful the world can be when you share it with someone you love." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Then he kissed her while the first snowflakes began to fall, and Mason felt something settle in his soul, a sense of rightness he had never experienced before. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Nebraska City church. Zara's aunt had finally returned from Denver and was scandalized that Zara had agreed to marry a cowboy she had known for such a short time. But she came to the wedding anyway because Zara was stubborn in her own gentle way and refused to be dissuaded. Margaret Henriksen stood up as Zara's matron of honor, and Carl stood up as Mason's best man. The Henriksen boys sat in the front pew and made noise during the vows, but nobody minded because they were young and excited, and Zara had become important to them over the past few months. Mason wore his best suit, which Carl had loaned him because his own clothes were too worn for a wedding. Zara wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself with fabric Margaret helped her purchase in town. She carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that she had pressed and preserved from the summer because she said she wanted to carry something that represented the land they were making their home. When the preacher told Mason he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that made several of the women in the congregation dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Zara kissed him back with such joy that Mason thought his heart might burst from the fullness of it. They spent their wedding night in the room Mason had been renting above the general store. It was not fancy, but Zara had spent the previous week making it beautiful, hanging curtains she had sewn from fabric scraps, arranging wildflowers in a cracked vase, spreading a quilt Margaret had given them across the narrow bed. She had turned that plain room into a home, just like she turned everything she touched into something lovely. Mason was nervous because it had been a long time since he had been with a woman, and he wanted everything to be perfect for Zara. But she was patient and kind, guiding him with gentle touches and whispered words. And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like they had been made to fit together exactly this way. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt, Zara's head on Mason's chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I did not know it could be like that," Zara whispered. So tender and beautiful. Neither did I, Mason admitted. Everything with you is better than I thought life could be. She tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. We are going to have a wonderful life together, Mason. I can feel it. I can feel it too, he said, and he held her close and listened to her breathing even out as she fell asleep. And he thought about how miraculous it was that a single chance encounter with a woman looking at a wildflower had changed absolutely everything. The winter of 1878 was hard, as winters in Nebraska often were, but Mason and Zara weathered it together in their room above the general store. Mason continued working at the Henriksen Ranch, and Zara continued helping Margaret and giving art lessons when she could. They saved every penny they could spare, dreaming of the day when they could afford a small piece of land and a house of their own. On Christmas Eve, they stood together at the window of their room, watching snow fall over Nebraska City, the town transformed into something magical by the white covering. Look how beautiful it is, Zara said, her breath fogging the glass. Every rooftop looks like it has been frosted like a cake, and see how the lamplight makes the snow glow golden? It is like the whole world is celebrating. Mason wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. You make me see magic in everything. There is magic in everything, she said, turning in his arms to face him. You just have to look for it, and I have something magical to tell you, something I have been waiting for the right moment to share. His heart skipped. What is it? She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We are going to have a baby. Around July, the doctor thinks. Mason felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. A baby, his baby, their baby, a whole new life they had created together. Fear and joy warred in his chest because he remembered too well how his sister had died, but the joy was stronger. Are you happy? Zara asked, watching his face anxiously. I am terrified, he admitted, but I am also happier than I have ever been. A baby, Zara. We are going to have a baby. She laughed and cried at the same time, and Mason held her and thought about the future, about teaching a son or daughter to see the world the way Zara saw it, full of beauty and possibility and wonder. The news of the baby motivated them to accelerate their plans. Carl Henriksen, who had grown fond of both of them, offered to sell them 5 acres of land on the edge of his property at a price they could afford if they stretched their savings. There was a small creek running through it and a grove of cottonwood trees that Zara immediately fell in love with. We can build our house right there, she said, pointing to a gentle rise that overlooked the creek. So we can wake up to the sound of water every morning, and we can plant a garden over there where the ground is flattest, and maybe eventually we can have some chickens and a milk cow. Mason could see it all as she described it, could picture the life they would build together on this small piece of land. We will need to get the house built before the baby comes. That only gives us about 6 months. Then we better get started, Zara said, and there was such determination in her voice that Mason knew they would make it happen, no matter what it took. They spent the winter months planning and saving. Carl helped Mason gather lumber and materials, sometimes at cost, sometimes as gifts. The Henriksens had become like family to them, and Margaret was as excited about the baby as if it were her own grandchild coming. When spring arrived and the ground thawed enough to work, Mason began building. He was a fair hand at carpentry, having learned from his father, and Carl came by whenever he could spare time to help. Other men from the ranch pitched in on their days off, and slowly, board by board, the house took shape. It was not a large house, just 3 rooms. A main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom, and a small room that would be for the baby. But it was solid and well made, and Zara made it beautiful. She painted the walls with whitewash and stenciled designs around the windows. She made curtains from flour sacks that she bleached and dyed with plants she foraged. She built shelves from scrap wood and filled them with her books and art supplies and the small treasures she had collected. They moved in on a warm day in May, when the wildflowers were blooming in abundance. Zara was 5 months pregnant now, her belly gently rounded, and she moved through the house touching everything with such reverence that Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. It is perfect, she said, standing in the main room and turning in a slow circle. Mason, you built us a home, a real home. We built it, he corrected, pulling her into his arms carefully. Everything we have, we built together. That night, they christened their new bed in their new house. making love slowly and carefully because Mason was afraid of hurting the baby, though Zara assured him that was not how it worked. Afterward, they lay together listening to the creek and the night birds, and Mason thought about how far he had come from the angry lost man he had been just 8 months earlier. "I need to tell you something," Zara said quietly into the darkness. "Something I have been thinking about a lot." "What is it?" Mason asked, stroking her hair. "When I first came to Nebraska City, I felt like I was running away from my life. My parents were gone. I had no real home, no purpose. I was just drifting from one relative to another, never quite fitting anywhere. But then I found you, and I realized I was not running away from anything. I was running toward you, toward this life. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I was dead before you came. I was breathing and walking around, but I was not alive. You brought me back to life, Zara. You taught me to see again, to feel again. You saved me." "We saved each other," she said, and she took his hand and placed it on her belly where the baby was starting to move, small flutters that felt like butterflies under his palm. "And now, we are going to save this little one by giving them a home full of love and beauty and all the good things we never want them to doubt." "Yes," Mason agreed, and he held his wife and felt their child move under his hand, and he knew with absolute certainty that this was what he had been meant for all along, this love, this family, this life. Summer arrived hot and bright, and Zara's belly grew round and heavy. She still worked in her garden every morning before the heat grew too intense, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers all mixed together in a glorious tangle that was somehow both chaotic and beautiful. Mason built her a bench under the cottonwood trees where she could sit and sketch, and she filled page after page with drawings of their land, their house, the plants and animals that lived around them. On a blazing hot day in mid-July, Zara went into labor. Mason rode hell for leather to fetch Margaret Henriksen and the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, an old German woman who had delivered half the babies in the county. Then he was banished from the bedroom while the women worked, and he paced the main room like a caged animal, terrified in a way he had not been terrified since he watched his sister die. But Zara was stronger than Emily had been, and the labor, though long, progressed well. As the sun was setting, turning the sky into ribbons of orange and pink and purple that Zara would have loved, Mason heard a thin, angry wail. He froze, hardly daring to breathe, until Margaret opened the door with a smile on her face. "You have a son," she said, "a healthy, loud son, and your wife is tired but doing well." Mason burst into the room and found Zara propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted, but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with such love and pride that he felt tears sting his eyes. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Mason approached like he was walking on sacred ground and looked down at the tiny red face peering out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making little snuffling sounds, his eyes squeezed shut. "He is perfect," Mason whispered, afraid to touch something so small and fragile. "Hold him," Zara urged, and she transferred the baby into Mason's arms with Margaret's help. The weight of his son in his arms was the most profound thing Mason had ever experienced. This tiny person, half him and half Zara, a completely new life that had not existed before. He stared down at the baby in wonder, watching the little mouth work, the tiny fingers curl and uncurl. "What should we name him?" Zara asked. They had discussed names endlessly over the past months, but now, holding his son, only one name felt right. "Matthew," Mason said. "Matthew James Harding. Matthew after my father, James after yours." "Matthew," Zara repeated, and she smiled. "It is perfect. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the world, little one. You are so loved already." The baby chose that moment to open his eyes, unfocused but searching, and Mason felt something in his chest expand to almost painful proportions. This was his son, his family, the life he had built with Zara, tangible and real and more precious than anything he had ever imagined. The first few months with Matthew were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby cried a lot, especially at night, and Mason and Zara took turns walking him around the house, bouncing him gently, singing to him in voices rough with sleep deprivation. But there were also moments of such perfect beauty that Mason wanted to freeze time. Zara nursing Matthew in the rocking chair Mason had built, sunlight streaming through the window and making her hair glow like a halo. The baby's first real smile, which he gave to Mason at 3 weeks old during a diaper change. The way Matthew would calm down when they took him outside to look at the trees and the sky, as if he had inherited his mother's appreciation for the natural world. "Look at him," Zara said one autumn afternoon as they sat together on the porch, Matthew asleep in her arms. "He is fascinated by the leaves falling. See how his eyes track them? He is already learning to see beauty." "He has a good teacher," Mason said, putting his arm around his wife and pulling her close. "Two good teachers now." Life settled into a rhythm. Mason worked the ranch, Zara managed their small homestead, and continued giving art lessons when she could manage it with the baby. Matthew grew and thrived, hitting all his milestones in the way healthy babies do. He was a happy child, quick to smile, curious about everything around him. On their first wedding anniversary, Mason and Zara stood together on the hill where he had proposed. Matthew bundled warmly against the December cold. The year had brought so many changes, so much growth, that Mason could hardly believe he was the same man who had fought in the street with blood on his knuckles. "I was thinking," Zara said, watching the sun set over the valley, "about what our life looks like now compared to a year ago. We were two people trying to figure out if we fit together. Now, we are a family. We have a home and a child and a future we are building together. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." "You made it possible," Mason said, shifting Matthew to his other arm. "Before you, I could not see past the next day. I certainly could not imagine having something like this. A real life. A good life." "We made it possible together," Zara corrected, leaning into him. "That is what love does, Mason. It takes two incomplete people and makes them whole together." Matthew chose that moment to wake up and start fussing, and they headed back to the house, laughing about how their romantic moment had been interrupted by their son's need for dinner. But Mason would not have changed it for anything. This was his life now, messy and loud and full of dirty diapers and sleepless nights, but also full of love and laughter, and those moments of perfect beauty that Zara had taught him to recognize. The years rolled on, measured in Matthew's growth and the changing seasons and the steady accumulation of small joys. When Matthew was 2, Zara announced she was pregnant again. When Matthew was almost 3, she gave birth to twin daughters they named Margaret Rose and Lily Jane, after Margaret Henriksen and Zara's mother. The births were hard, twin deliveries always being more complicated, but both girls came out screaming and healthy, and Zara recovered well with Margaret's help and care. Mason thought his heart could not hold any more love, but somehow it expanded to make room for both daughters, for their tiny fingers wrapping around his, for the way they looked at him with complete trust and adoration. Matthew was enchanted by his sisters, bringing them his toys and patting their heads with surprising gentleness for a small boy. The house felt crowded now with 5 of them, so Mason added on another room, working in the evenings and on Sundays, until they had a proper second bedroom where Matthew could sleep while the girls shared the original small room. Carl Henriksen, who was getting older and had no children of his own to leave his land to, announced that he was making Mason a partner in the ranch. It meant more responsibility, but also more income, and Mason knew it was Carl's way of making sure the Harding family would be provided for long after Carl was gone. "You are like the son I never had," Carl told Mason gruffly the day they signed the papers making it official. "You and your family have brought me and Margaret more joy than I can express. This ranch will be yours someday, and I know you will take care of it." Mason had to clear his throat several times before he could respond. "You and Margaret took a chance on me when I was not worth much of anything. I will never forget that." "You were always worth something," Carl replied. "You just needed the right woman to help you see it." That night, Mason told Zara about the partnership, and she cried happy tears and kissed him soundly while the children slept in the next room. "Your hard work is paying off. Everything we have dreamed of is coming true." "Not everything yet," Mason said, and he pulled out a packet of papers he had been hiding. "I filed a claim for another 40 acres adjacent to ours. The government approved it. We have more land now, enough to really build something for our children to inherit, enough to give them security." Zara looked at the papers with wonder. "Mason, this is incredible. How did you manage it?" "I have been saving and planning for months." Carl helped with the paperwork. "I want our children to have what I did not have, a real legacy. a place that is truly theirs. She kissed him again, deeper this time, with a passion that had not dimmed over their years together. You are a remarkable man, Mason Harding. Never doubt that. They made love that night with the quiet intensity of two people who knew each other's bodies intimately, who had learned how to communicate with touches and sighs, who had built something beautiful and lasting together. Afterward, lying tangled together, Mason thought about the man he had been when he first saw Zara looking at that wildflower. He barely recognized that angry, lost version of himself. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "I am thinking about how you changed my life," he said honestly. "How you taught me to see the world differently. I was so angry before you came, so closed off. But you showed me that there was still beauty in the world, still reasons to hope and dream and feel." "You were never as closed off as you thought," Zara said. "That capacity for love and wonder was always inside you. I just helped you remember it was there. And you did the same for me, you know. Before I met you, I felt so adrift, like I was floating through life without an anchor. You gave me a home, Mason, a real home, not just a place to sleep, but a place to belong." "We belong to each other," he said, pulling her closer. "And to those 3 sleeping miracles in the next room. We built this together, Zara. Everything good in my life came from you." As Matthew grew older, he showed his mother's keen eye for beauty and his father's quiet strength. He would spend hours helping Zara in the garden or following Mason around the ranch, asking endless questions about the animals and the land. The twins, though only toddlers, were already showing distinct personalities. Margaret was bold and adventurous, always climbing things and testing boundaries, while Lily was gentler, content to sit and look at picture books or play quietly with her dolls. One spring day when Matthew was 5 and the twins were 2, Zara took all 3 children down to the creek to play while Mason worked on repairing a section of fence. She settled on the bank with her sketchbook while the children played in the shallow water under her watchful eye. Matthew was teaching his sisters how to skip stones, though their chubby hands could not quite manage the proper flick needed to make the stones bounce. Zara was sketching the scene, trying to capture the way the sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves and dappled the water, when Matthew suddenly called out, "Mama, look, I found something beautiful." He came running over, muddy and wet, holding out his hand. In his palm was a simple river stone, smooth and gray. "What makes it beautiful, love?" Zara asked, because she always wanted her children to explain their thinking. "It is smooth like an egg, and see how it has all these little spots? They look like freckles, like the ones on Lily's nose. And when it is wet, it shines. Is that not beautiful?" Zara felt tears prick her eyes, because here was her son at 5 years old, finding beauty in a simple stone, just like she had taught him, just like she had taught his father. "It is incredibly beautiful," she agreed, taking the stone and examining it properly. "And you know what makes it even more beautiful? The fact that you took the time to really look at it and notice all its special qualities. That is a gift, Matthew. Never lose it." "Papa says you taught him to see things like this too," Matthew said, sitting down beside her on the bank. "He says before he met you, he did not notice beautiful things." "Your papa has always had the ability to see beauty," Zara said, stroking Matthew's wet hair. "He just forgot how for a while. Sometimes when people go through sad things, they forget to notice the good. But the good is always there, waiting to be seen again. I am going to remember to always see it," Matthew declared with the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old. "And I am going to teach Margaret and Lily too." "You are a wonderful big brother," Zara said, kissing the top of his head. "And you have a beautiful heart." That evening, after the children were in bed, Zara told Mason about the conversation. He held the river stone Matthew had found, turning it over in his work-roughened hands. "He is going to be a good man," Mason said quietly. "Better than I was at his age, better than I was before you." "He is going to be exactly who he is meant to be," Zara said, "just like you became exactly who you were meant to be. People grow and change, Mason. That is the beautiful thing about being human. We are not fixed. We can always learn to see differently, to be better." The seasons turned, one into another, into another. There were hard times, years when the cattle prices dropped, or when drought made water scarce. There were illnesses and accidents and all the normal struggles that come with farming and ranching in an unforgiving land. But there were also endless moments of joy. Margaret's first day of school, where she insisted on wearing her best dress and carried an apple for the teacher. Lily learning to read and discovering she loved stories almost as much as she loved drawing. Matthew helping deliver his first calf and coming back to the house at dawn, exhausted and proud and covered in blood and birthing fluid. When Matthew was 12, he came home from school one day looking troubled. Mason was replacing a board on the porch, and he set down his hammer when he saw his son's expression. "What is wrong?" he asked. Matthew sat down on the porch steps, his long legs sprawling out in front of him. He was going to be tall, maybe taller than Mason. "There is a new boy at school. His name is Thomas, and his family just moved here from Kansas. The other boys are being mean to him because his clothes are old and patched, and he does not have money for a proper lunch. They were laughing at him today, and I wanted to punch them, but I remembered what you told me about fighting only solving problems temporarily." Mason felt a swell of pride at his son's restraint. "So, what did you do?" "I sat with him at lunch and shared my food, and I told the other boys to shut their mouths, or they would answer to me. That part was not very nice, but I was angry." "Sometimes anger in defense of someone who cannot defend themselves is appropriate," Mason said carefully, "as long as you do not let it control you. Did Thomas appreciate your help?" "I think so. He was pretty quiet. He seemed ashamed, which made me even angrier because he should not have to feel ashamed about being poor. We were poor once, were we not? Before you became partners with Mr. Henriksen?" "We were," Mason confirmed. "Not so poor we went hungry, but we did not have much. And I remember what it felt like to be looked down on because of it. You did the right thing, Matthew. Standing up for people who need help, that is what good men do." "Is that what Mama did for you?" Matthew asked, with the directness of youth. "I heard Mrs. Henriksen telling Mama once that you were lost before Mama found you. Did she stand up for you?" Mason was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "Your mother saw me when I could not see myself. She helped me understand that my worth was not determined by my past or my circumstances. She taught me to see beauty and hope in the world again. In a way, yes, she stood up for me. She stood up for the man I could be, even when I had forgotten that man existed." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "I am going to keep being friends with Thomas. Maybe I can help him see that he has worth too." "I think that is an excellent idea," Mason said, and he put his arm around his son's shoulders, grateful beyond measure that his children were growing up with open hearts and the ability to see people truly, the way Zara had taught all of them to see. When Matthew turned 16, he started courting a girl named Sarah who lived on a neighboring farm. She was a pretty thing with blonde braids and a practical nature, and Mason liked her well enough, but he noticed that Matthew never looked at Sarah the way Mason looked at Zara, with that sense of wonder and deep connection. "Do you love her?" Mason asked one evening when they were checking the fences together. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "I like her. She's nice, and we get along well. But I do not think I love her the way you love Mama. When you look at Mama, it is like the whole world lights up. I do not feel that with Sarah." "Then you should not marry her," Mason said firmly. "Life is too short to spend it with someone who does not make your world light up. Wait for the person who does." "Did you know right away that Mama was that person?" Matthew asked. Mason thought back to that day in the street, watching Zara kneel beside a wildflower. "I knew something was different about her from the first moment I saw her, but falling in love, real love, that took time. It took learning who she was, seeing how she moved through the world, understanding the way her mind worked. You will know when you find the right person, Matthew. Trust your heart, and do not settle for less than what you deserve." Matthew broke things off with Sarah a few weeks later, gently and respectfully, and Sarah took it well enough. A year later, she married a blacksmith's apprentice from the next county, and everyone agreed they seemed well suited. Margaret and Lily grew into young women, both beautiful in different ways. Margaret was tall and athletic, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. She loved horses and could ride better than most of the ranch hands. Lily was smaller and quieter, with brown hair like her mother's and a talent for painting that exceeded even Zara's abilities. She wanted to go to art school in Omaha, and Mason was determined to find a way to send her, even though it would mean her being gone for months at a time. "She has a real gift," Zara said one evening, as they looked at Lily's latest painting. A landscape of their land that captured not just what it looked like, but how it felt to live there. "We need to nurture that, even if it means letting her go." "I know," Mason said, though the thought of any of his children leaving made his chest ache. "We want them to have opportunities we never had. That is the whole point of everything we have built." Carl Henriksen died peacefully in his sleep when Mason was 42 years old. Margaret Henriksen had passed 5 years earlier, and Carl had seemed diminished without her, as if half of himself had disappeared. He left the entire ranch to Mason, just as he had promised years ago. It was a huge responsibility, but Mason had been essentially running it for the past decade anyway. What made him emotional was the letter Carl had left with his will. "Mason, you came to me as an angry young man who thought he was worthless, and you are leaving this world as a wealthy rancher with a beautiful family. But the wealth is not in the land or the cattle. It is in the love you found with Zara and the children you raised together. Never forget that. Take care of this land, and it will take care of your family for generations. You were the son of my heart, and I am proud of the man you became. Carl." Mason read the letter aloud to Zara that night, and they both cried, mourning the loss of a man who had been so important to their lives. "He was right, you know," Zara said, wiping her eyes. "The wealth is in the love. Everything else is just bonus." "I know," Mason said. "You taught me that a long time ago." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason planned something special. He arranged for Margaret to watch the younger children. Matthew was away at a cattle auction, and he took Zara back to the hill where he had proposed. It was November again, 20 years almost to the day since he had asked her to marry him, and the weather was cold but clear. They stood together looking out over the valley, over the ranch that was now theirs, the house they had built, the life they had created. Zara's hair had some silver threads now, and Mason had crow's feet around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But they were still the same people who had fallen in love beside a wildflower in the street. 20 years, Zara said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together." "I could not have imagined any of this," Mason said, pulling her close. "That day I saw you looking at that prairie clover. If someone had told me I would end up here, with you and 3 incredible children and a successful ranch, I would have said they were insane. I was so lost, Zara. I had given up on everything good. But you were not too lost to see me," Zara pointed out. "You could have walked past, but you stopped. You opened yourself up to possibility, even when it frightened you. That took courage, Mason." "You made it easy," he said. "You made everything easier and better and more beautiful. Every single day with you has been a gift." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his weathered face. "Do you know what I love most about our life? It is not perfect. We have had hard times and sad times and moments when we did not know how we would manage. But through all of it, we never stopped seeing the beauty. We never stopped appreciating what we have. That is what I tried to teach you all those years ago, and you learned it better than I could have hoped. You see beauty everywhere now, Mason. You taught our children to see it too." "I learned from the best teacher," Mason said, and he kissed her there on the hilltop, the same spot where he had asked her to marry him 2 decades earlier, and he felt the same rush of love and gratitude and wonder that he had felt then. When Matthew was 21, he met a woman named Emma at a harvest dance. She was visiting from Omaha, staying with her uncle who owned a dry goods store in town, and Matthew took one look at her and went completely silent, which was unusual for his normally talkative son. Mason watched from across the room as Matthew finally worked up the courage to ask Emma to dance, and he saw the way his son looked at her, like she was the only person in the room. "That is how you look at me," Zara whispered beside him, watching the same scene. "That is how everyone should look at the person they love," Mason replied. Matthew courted Emma for a year, traveling to Omaha as often as he could, writing her letters that filled page after page with his thoughts and dreams. When he finally brought her home to meet the family, Mason understood immediately why his son had fallen so hard. Emma was smart and kind and had a laugh that made everyone around her smile. She was studying to be a teacher, and she talked about education with a passion that reminded Mason of Zara talking about art. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony much larger than Mason and Zara's had been, because by now the Harding family was well established and well liked in the community. Emma cried when she said her vows, and Matthew's voice shook, and Mason felt Zara's hand tighten in his as they watched their firstborn promise his life to someone else. "They are going to be so happy," Zara whispered. "Yes," Mason agreed, though part of him ached at the passage of time, at the realization that his children were grown and starting their own lives. Matthew and Emma built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, and Emma got a job teaching at the Nebraska City school. A year later, they had a daughter they named Zara, and Mason held his granddaughter in his arms and marveled at how life continued to surprise him with joy he never anticipated. Margaret married at 24 to a veterinarian named Daniel who moved to Nebraska City to start a practice. They were perfect for each other, both passionate about animals and the land, and they built a house in town near Daniel's office. Lily did go to art school in Omaha and flourished there, but she came home every summer and painted scenes of the ranch and the surrounding landscape that eventually gained her some recognition in artistic circles. She never married, finding fulfillment in her art and her independence, and Mason and Zara supported her choices completely. As Mason and Zara moved into their 50s, they began to slow down, handing more and more of the ranch responsibilities over to Matthew while they focused on the garden and the grandchildren who visited often. Mason had 9 grandchildren by the time he was 55, and he spoiled every one of them shamelessly. One summer evening, when he and Zara were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Zara leaned her head on his shoulder and sighed contentedly. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, a question he had asked her thousands of times over their years together. "I am thinking about that day I saw a wildflower growing through the boardwalk," she said. "How it seemed like such a small thing, stopping to look at it. But it changed absolutely everything. If I had not stopped, you might have walked past. We might never have met. None of this would exist. I would have found you somehow," Mason said with certainty. "I was meant to find you. You were meant to teach me how to see the world differently. That was always going to happen." "You really believe that?" Zara asked, lifting her head to look at him. "I do. Some things are just meant to be. We were meant to be." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky turned from blue to pink to purple to deep indigo. Fireflies began to appear, blinking in the gathering darkness. From inside the house, they could hear Lily talking to herself as she worked on a painting. Margaret and Lily were both visiting for the summer, and the house felt full and alive in a way that made Mason's heart sing. "Thank you," Zara said suddenly. "For what?" Mason asked, surprised. "For seeing me that day. For stopping and talking to me, even though you thought I was strange for caring about a weed. For opening your heart even when it terrified you. For building this life with me. For being exactly the partner I needed. For everything, Mason. Thank you for everything." He pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for teaching me how to live again. For showing me beauty when I had forgotten it existed. For loving me when I was not very lovable. For giving me a family and a purpose and a reason to wake up, grateful every single morning. I was half dead before you came along, Zara. You brought me back to life. We brought each other back to life," she said. "That is what love does. It makes us more than we were alone." They grew old together, watching their children thrive and their grandchildren grow. Matthew took over the ranch completely when Mason turned 60, and Mason was content to let him, spending his days helping Zara in the garden, or playing with grandchildren, or simply sitting and watching the world turn through his wife's eyes. When Mason was 68 and Zara was 65, they took a trip back to that hill one last time. It was harder to climb now, their joints stiff with age, but they made it to the top and stood together looking out over the valley. "Do you remember when we first came here?" Zara asked. "You were so nervous about proposing. Your hands were shaking." "I thought you might say no," Mason admitted. "I thought I was asking for too much, too soon. I would have said yes if you had asked me after a week," Zara confessed. "I knew right away that you were the one. I just had to wait for you to figure it out too." Mason laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Zara agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. We built something beautiful together, Mason. Not just the ranch or the house, but a family, a legacy. Our children know how to love well because we showed them. Our grandchildren will know it too. That is the greatest gift we could give." "You gave me that gift first," Mason said. "You taught me what love looks like, what it means to really see another person and be seen in return. Everything good in my life flows from you." They stood there together as the sun set one more time, painting the sky in the colors Zara had always loved. Mason thought about that young man with blood on his knuckles who had stopped in the street to argue with a woman about a wildflower. He thought about how far he had come, how much he had learned, how completely his life had been transformed by love. "I would do it all again," he said quietly. "Every single moment. The hard parts and the beautiful parts and everything in between. I would choose you every time, Zara Montgomery Harding." "And I would choose you," she said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Every single time. You were worth stopping for, Mason. You were worth everything." They made their way back down the hill as darkness fell, holding hands to steady each other. And Mason knew that whatever time they had left, they would face it together, still seeing beauty in the world, still grateful for every sunrise and sunset, an ordinary miracle of their extraordinary life. Mason Harding died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, with Zara beside him holding his hand. He went to bed after a good day spent with his family, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the evidence of a life well lived, and simply did not wake up. Zara said afterward that it was a gift, the way he went. No suffering or long decline, just a gentle transition from one state to another. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Nebraska City and the surrounding countryside. Matthew gave a eulogy that made everyone cry, talking about his father's transformation from a lost, angry young man to a loving husband and father who saw beauty everywhere because his wife had taught him how. Zara lived for another 3 years after Mason's death. She spent her days in the garden they had built together, sketching and painting, and spending time with her children and grandchildren. She never seemed sad exactly, though she clearly missed Mason terribly. When people asked her how she was managing, she would smile and say that she was grateful for every year she had been given with him, and that gratitude outweighed the grief. She died on a bright spring morning, surrounded by wildflowers, with her sketchbook open beside her. Lily found her there in the garden, looking peaceful, a soft smile on her face. In her last sketch, barely finished, was a drawing of a prairie clover growing through a crack, and underneath it, in her familiar handwriting, "Everything begins with seeing. Love most of all." They buried Zara beside Mason on the hill overlooking the ranch, the place where he had proposed and where they had returned again and again throughout their lives together. The whole family gathered there, 3 generations of Hardings, and Matthew read the words his mother had written in her final sketch. "She taught us all to see," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught our father first, when he needed it most, and then she taught all of us. And now, we have to carry that lesson forward, teaching our children and our children's children to look for beauty, to really see the world and each other. That is how we honor them both." Years later, long after both Mason and Zara were gone, their great-grandchildren would play on that same hill, picking wildflowers and skipping stones in the creek, learning the stories of the cowboy who forgot how to see beauty, and the woman from Boston who taught him to look at the world with wonder again. They would learn about love that transforms, about the courage it takes to open your heart after it has been broken, about finding beauty in the most unlikely places and people. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations of Hardings who understood that the real wealth was not in the land or the cattle, but in the love that had founded it all. And every spring, without fail, prairie clover would grow in the most unexpected places, pushing through cracks and hardship to reach the sun. Stubborn and beautiful and impossible to ignore, just like the love that had started it all.